I am with Blaney from the Aboriginal Women's Action Network. We were hoping to speak a bit about Faye's judgment and critique of the final report that the National Inquiry for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls issued earlier this year. But I thought of contextualizing it by going with Faye a little bit to where it all started. December 2015, once the Liberal government was, federal Liberal government was elected, and they announced that they're going to launch a national inquiry. I believe that December 2008 is when the CEDAW, the UN body that overseeing implementation of women's rights across the world, recommended that Canada will conduct a national inquiry. So, and that was after mainly Indigenous women use all kinds of avenues and platforms to lobby to the United Nations. So that was, there was some formal recognition in 2008, and it took another 7 years for the government to actually take it on. And that happened in December, and shortly after, Faye, you asked to meet with us, and you asked us how can we help you to do something about it.
So I did reach out to Vancouver Rape Relief, and it was at a time when I hadn't done a whole lot of organizing with the Aboriginal Women's Action Network. I didn't have a huge group. There were still some members that were there, but I reached out to Vancouver Rape Relief because I had some huge concerns about what would happen within the inquiry. It was right on the heels of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I was really concerned that the TRC was largely testimonial, and then at the end of the day somebody went off and wrote, or some bodies went off and wrote the final report and developed the recommendations. And as a feminist and organizer, I really felt that we could do that ourselves at the grassroots level. And so that was one of the really big concerns I had of the national inquiry. And another big one that I had was just the framing of the issue as a family's first agenda that the federal government was articulating it. And I appreciate the families. I'm definitely not against any of the families that have worked so hard to bring attention to their loved ones that they've lost or that have been disappeared. But here in Vancouver with the annual Valentine's Day Memorial March, that was a grassroots initiative. It later became institutionalized, and it's still institutionalized. I'm quite critical of that, but I won't spend a lot of time on that here. My point is that it should be continue to be a grassroots initiative amongst Indigenous women. And so Indigenous women were calling for greater attention to the murdered and missing in the downtown east side. And when the Picton investigation happened, 1/3 of those women were Indigenous women. And I would venture to say that all 14 or so of those women, 17, I can't remember the exact number, were not attached to families, and neither are a lot of the Indigenous women in the downtown east side. They're not attached to families, and in fact they very much have a reality like I do, that I fled violence. I fled from my family. That's where the violence was coming from, was from my family. And I guess that just, you know, goes back to the patriarchy that colonialism is so steeped in. So that was one of the concerns I had, was the family's first agenda. And I mentioned as well the healing agenda and the fact that we should give testimony in front of large audiences in order to heal. And there was this big focus on healing. And my sobriety, I just had a sobriety celebration a couple of weeks ago. My sobriety came about as a result of a consciousness raising, a politicization that happened for me. And I was very blessed to have that happen, because much of the self-help work that we do focuses on me as an addict or whatever the dysfunction is, and it doesn't look at the broader society, the role of systems and structures in what happens to me in my lived experience. So that healing model really disturbed me in the inquiry, that we would all emote in front of whatever, and then someone else would come up with the solutions, the recommendations, what have you. And I ventured to say that that did happen somewhat as well. We also were in a time when there was a men's group. They were arguing that the inquiry should include men and boys. And that was really devastating for me. That really frightened me because of the fact that it would obscure the patriarchy within the colonization process. And and they really pushed to have that happen. And it was the men's groups, the chiefs groups, that organized the roundtables early on. And it was the men's groups in this province, or the chiefs groups, that organized the memorandum of understanding around what would happen in cases of violence in our communities. And I don't know why no one was asking the question of why are these initiatives not being led by Indigenous women. It's very disheartening, because as Indigenous people, we're very versed in our own oppression around colonialism, but we really seriously do not understand the sexism and misogyny in our community, and it's happening right in front of our faces, and no one is questioning the fact that it's chiefs organizations that are leading these initiatives. And I guess the final thing I would say, in talking to Rape Relief, we had a few meetings, and at that point you had a few Indigenous women, and I was talking to them as well. We were concerned about the broad scope of the inquiry, and I really had my concerns that they would lose sight of patriarchy, and I think they did to some extent. I mean, they focused on colonization largely when they talk about the roots of what resulted in the murdered and missing. And the recommendations really reflect that they talk about Indigenous communities. And I was at one of the roundtables, and an elder there, she was the chair of the Women's Council, was saying, why is it that you're talking about Indigenous peoples? Are we not talking about Indigenous women and girls in this circumstance? And of course she was overruled, and I felt very sad about that. And she was the women's rep of the Assembly of First Nations.
So then you told us, and I think that it was very clear for both groups from the beginning, the chance of us having any influence on the formal institutional federal process was we would be naive, that we will think we will make an impact, but how can we use that moment to organize, to create public education? And we organized 2 gatherings with 70 Indigenous women and allies.
Yeah, and those gatherings, my sense of my own organizing over the years and my consciousness raising has come as a result of engaging with other feminists. And so And when I look across the country, when I encounter other Indigenous women that have a political consciousness about feminism, it's usually the Indigenous women that work in shelters and transition houses and women's groups. And so I know that we have our struggles there. I'm not being naive when, I've experienced it firsthand myself trying to enter the women's movement and the discrimination that I've experienced there where non-Native women don't understand our issues and concerns, and that's definitely a sore spot in our own communities when we're being attacked for being feminist, that, you're hanging around with those white women over there. Having said that, I find that there is the best traction amongst women's groups, much more than I would say within our own communities. It's always decolonization first and women's issues later. And in any of those different types of movements that I've participated in, I would say that I've made the most gains within the feminist movement. And so the gathering was intended to be a consciousness-raising opportunity for us. It was rebuilding the Aboriginal Women's Action Network again so that we could be a voice for Indigenous women. It was a pretty scary time for me because I didn't feel that I was adequately organized. I'd had a lot of contacts across the country, but I had lost touch with a lot of those people, and I really wanted this key moment to put out Indigenous women's voices. And whenever I'm out there in the world and across the country, there are Indigenous women that are so grateful that I'm articulating their concerns and talking about the feminist issues that we encounter. So we're out there, there's no doubt about that. And the gatherings really showed that there were women that were really keen to organize. And I think the barriers are the government for one thing, our own communities, in our Indigenous communities. And there's a lot of barriers, resourcing barriers for us to be able to organize. So Rape Relief brought other non-Native women to our gathering, and we reached out to Indigenous women, mainly in the province, but we brought Indigenous women from other places. It was a very powerful 3 days, both times. The first one was on International Women's Day, and then the later one was on Aboriginal Day. And it was a very exciting time to be hearing these voices and having the conversations yet again.
And that was 2016. Then in August 2016, the government announced commissioner. There was some silent. It took the chosen commissioners approximately 9 months to figure out what they're going to do, with lots and lots of contradicting instructions from the government. And then in April 2017, there was an announcement to apply for standing that we did not quite clearly knew what it meant. It was obvious that it's going to be very heavily legal process. There was supposed to be a lawyer in the midst, a lawyer making the application. If there were funding, there were only funding for lawyers. But both A1 and Rape Relief decided not to repeat the mistakes that we did around the Opal inquiry, when all the groups, the instruction was that you have to have a lawyer to participate in the process, and all the groups who did not have staffed lawyer withdrew. And we decided that we're not going to let it be in our way, and that if needed, we will, as activists, we know how to speak up on our behalf of other women, and we will just do the work ourselves. So we submitted those applications. It was such a complicated process that it was obvious also that not many grassroots Indigenous women across the country who do not have a budget and an office and a computer can apply to that. So the deals that, and it's true, except A1, only women working together from Saskatchewan were able to meet the criteria that for the application of standing. So the deal was that we will give you whatever you need to make it happen, and we will join you as long as we can, to say the points that we have from the frontline work, and also to amplify or to reinforce whatever you're saying from wherever you're positioned. Then there was another year passed by. It was not really clear what's going to happen, and we got a phone call somewhere in the spring from the chief of the lawyer team that they, in a very, very short notice, they're going to have, at the beginning, 4 hearings, and then it turned out to be 8 hearings, and the first one will be about human rights, expert framework, and they solicited. They have some judgment who should be. They were mainly UN expert, some indigenous, some not. And they solicited some feedback, and we just had a fluke. Sometimes we get things just because we are the first and the last girl standing. Nobody stayed on the phone call except a few of us and our allies, and we started pushing for Faye's name to be as an expert witness. And enough women across the country, one of them is now a senator, another woman ended up to be, enough women across the country who has some influence pushed by putting Faye forward behind the scene. And she was really the only grassroots feminist in this panel. And all the 8 hearings, all the 8 panel, nobody said what you said. The first one, the 2 voices that were in the first expert hearing was, one was government must reform, must yield to UN declaration, must accept UN treaties and agreement in relation to how to treat indigenous women and how to treat women. And the other way was return, give autonomy to indigenous people for self-governing. And the only woman, the only person who said, we want neither, because both the state and our communities have consumed this patriarchy. So the answer is independent indigenous women's movement.
Yeah, so I made the case from the get-go that it was important to have autonomous voices for indigenous women's groups, and I felt pretty sad that I don't really think that they heeded that voice. I talked about how consciousness-raising groups were the answer, that these international human rights instruments from on high weren't affecting change within our communities, that we needed to improve the status of indigenous women, not Indian status, but the status. You know, and in the early 70s, we had the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, and I said that we needed that kind of logic to create more places or opportunities for indigenous women to determine what our issues were and to address our issues ourselves without, you know, like I said early on, relying on someone else from on high to make those decisions for us. I guess the other thing that came up within all of that was the release of the RCMP's report citing that there were 1,100 and something indigenous women that were murdered or missing during a set period of time, and then the chief commissioner came out and said that the violence was internal and it was being perpetrated by indigenous men. And it very much reminded me of the release of the Ontario Native Women's Association's report in 1989. And in that report, they said that between 80 to 90% of indigenous women were being impacted by violence in their communities. And there was a huge pushback coming from the chiefs saying that they didn't want that report released publicly, that it would confirm in the racist imagination that we truly are savages. And in that debate that was going on, I do recognize that it's not just an internal issue as they were trying to paint it out to be, but that's the tightrope act that I walk between my own interests and concerns as an Indigenous person and as a feminist, as an Indigenous feminist. And so I was openly critical of Indigenous men and the role that they play in not only perpetrating the violence, but in not making men accountable, in covering up the violence in our own communities. And I think that gets into that huge push for access to justice or restorative justice as well. There's enough cases that we can cite where indigenous men, that's hard to say, that new word, Aboriginal is much easier, where men are perpetrating violence against women, and in healing circles or whatever it is, that Indigenous women don't stand a chance in that formulation. And so men walk with impunity, Indigenous men. So that was extremely uncomfortable in the inquiry, because the Indigenous people that were present, some of them were lawyers. There were way too many lawyers for my comfort. At the hearings, we became like a community ourselves. We began to know each other. But it was really, really, really uncomfortable having the lawyers from the Assembly of First Nations scowling at me all the time and seeing me as an enemy. That was really hard. I didn't like that. But I can't back down. There's no bloody way in hell I would back down from that, because there's... as frightened as I feel about that, there's way, way more Indigenous women that are like at the grassroots level experiencing the violence. So it was quite the coup to get me in there as an expert, because I am not a human rights expert, and I was talking to, where is Lee? There's Lee. Lee was talking to me about that, and the dynamic that I found myself, and she did a lot of work on me to prepare me before that, and it wasn't her feeding me information, it was her interrogating me and getting me to put things down on paper before I actually went there. And it was quite the exercise learning about the academics and the lawyers and these professionals documenting things and putting them at the international stage compared to the work that we do at the grassroots level of bringing out the issues. And that's what I was all about. They tried to ask me about international human rights, and I declined to answer, just saying, I'm not here about international human rights. I'm here because I'm a grassroots organizer. And so that's the position that I spoke from as a, quote, expert.
Yeah, and you can watch the video of a testimony on our website. And then there were 8 hearings altogether, and after the first one, you and us, we were party of standing, which means we get to cross-examine whomever the expert witness that the inquiry has brought forward. And we ourselves had some agenda. We wanted to counter the dichotomy that it's either sexism or racism. We wanted to, the right-wing version was that it's Indigenous men, and the liberal version was that it's no man. It just happened to these women. And we looked at 1,000 of our calls of Indigenous women from the last 5 years, and 40% of the women who called us were beaten or raped by Indigenous men from their community, and another 40% were raped or beaten by white men. For 10%, we didn't know what's the race of the attacker, and another 10% were raped or beaten by other men of color. And there is a lot of manipulation, and this is, of course, it's not an example of what happened in the world. It's just the cause that we get to rape relief. But there is a manipulation of the most acceptable institutionalized source of data is the RCMP report. And they're saying that 70% of the men who committed the violence are indigenous, but it's only 70% of the 50% that they know who the attacker is. And it's much easier to know who the attacker if it's done with the community. But most women who were killed by strangers, nobody knows what the race is. So based on what we know from our crisis line, it's likely when women are not in their communities, they will be raped and beaten and killed by white men who use the race and class, not just sex privilege. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the Cindy Gledoux case and the Supreme Court judgment that we dealt with a few months ago. So there were 8 hearings. A1, rape relief only went to 2, but Mackenzie and Faye were mastering, I don't know what power, but you went 8 times and you were there for the whole time and conducted course examination. And then in the summer, the final report is out. Mm-hmm. Many, many, many words, many, many, many pages. And we want to know what you think of that.
Well, we were, I don't know why I would be surprised, but surprised at the outcome, and we're very disappointed. And we mustered, Deanne is here today, and we got together with Deanne and Sherry Smiley, and there were a big group of us, some women from FAFIA, and we got together and began to talk about what we heard and what we saw. And of course, one of the big issues that A1 is really concerned about is prostitution and the fact that we're corralled into that as Indigenous women. And there wasn't enough attention, or hardly any attention, to that. There were other issues like child welfare, even within the hearings itself, where they talked about the children, but they didn't really talk about the moms. And that, to me, is really devastating, because it's now coming out with all of this attention on child welfare that the moms have a very high suicide rate. And in fact, at the end of the inquiry, one of my relatives from another community, she had her little boy apprehended and she hung herself. And so I imagine she's like the tip of the iceberg. I was looking at culture earlier, and there's this debate online on Facebook often about you must wear a skirt to all ceremonies, and it's like the ceremonies are very male dominated, reflective of the larger society. In the colonizing process, we had the Catholic Church coming into our community, and they imposed this new system on us. They appointed some men to be the church leaders, and my great-grandmother was ostracized because she was a witch. She was a healer, but they ostracized her. And so we're very colonized as far as our culture and our spirituality goes, and yet in the final report it's very generic. It talks about the importance of language for all Indigenous peoples, and this inquiry was supposed to be about women and girls, and what about the role of women and girls within our own ceremonies? I mean, we're still fighting the very basic thing of wearing skirts and not being allowed into ceremony when you're on your period, and those sorts of things that discriminate against women. Definitely that rationale and that understanding is within our cultures, but it's not been poisoned. In pre-contact times, it wasn't poisoned as it is now, where we're seen to be not clean, as I heard it when I was growing up. When you're on your menstrual cycle, you're not clean and you're not allowed near men. I think it was a completely different understanding. So there's nothing about that. In the health section, I see a service delivery model. you know, social workers, counselors, psychologists, on and on, instead of the feminist model. And this speaks to why I went to rape relief in the first place when I was looking for support on how to prepare for the inquiry, because I know the model that they draw upon. They have the same beliefs as I do around how we organize ourselves, and that is not based on a service delivery model. It's not like you become the expert and then you know, deliver the services to somebody who's the patient or the client. And it's more, I love the way Daisy talks about it, you know, we're equals, and we're women working together, and we're raising our consciousness, we're developing a political analysis of the reality that we live in. And that's why it's important for an autonomous Indigenous women's movement, so that we work together and we develop our understandings and we identify our solutions. But in the report, it's very much a service delivery model that they advance. It's victim services, another area of expertise, and we're perpetually the victim. The civilian oversight is all about Indigenous communities for policing, and there's some feminist models out there that draw on women to be the ones to do that oversight. I mean, we're the ones that understand what it means to be targeted by violence. I was thinking about protection orders, and that other woman that was on the panel with me, Tracy Dennison, I think it was. I felt so sad for her, and I kind of feel that experience now, being on my own reserve, where she says you get a protection order and then you go shopping and there he is, and how do you keep him away from her? It's like that in my community as well. It's ludicrous to advance this notion that there should be more protection orders in place when they're meaningless anyway. And in one section they were advancing Indigenous justice models. I didn't get to that one. There was a hearing on that before they granted us status, so I didn't hear what they said about Indigenous justice, but I'm concerned, definitely concerned about the role of Indigenous women in those communities, and whether we have enough organizing under our belt to advocate for ourselves in our own communities, or are we steeped in this normalization of violence where we blame ourselves? And that's the dynamic on my reserve, that the violence is so normalized and the women blame themselves for everything that happens to them. So of course, I don't know if it goes without saying that they didn't open any of the cases. The families and the women's organizations that wanted cases to be re-examined in the ways that the police looked at it, they managed to keep that out of the inquiry completely, and that was very sad. And I think there's a lot of those cases that merit re-examination, but we're never going to know because the police have yet again gotten away with what they always get away with.
So ironically, well, not surprisingly, the only recommendations that we made, rape relief, that was accepted in full, had nothing to do with male violence against women. The final report does call for the implementation of guaranteed livable income. Mm-hmm. But that's a very, very small victory. We really failed on convincing about feminist oversight and transparency of the criminal justice system, about the idea of holding men accountable, and about understanding prostitution as an oppressive force that keeps Indigenous women down, and reinforce men's entitlement over Indigenous women's body. Mm-hmm.
They didn't even get to the prisons either, which really was horrible. Right. They never talked to Indigenous women that are being incarcerated, and that's one of the fastest growing populations of incarcerated people are Indigenous women. And
42%. Indigenous women are 4% from the general female population, and there are 42% of women in prison.
Mm-hmm. And I was at a gathering, I don't know when, these things blur in my mind at my age, but I was at a gathering and there was an Indigenous woman talking about being sexually assaulted in prison by a transgendered that was put into the women's prison. And yeah, they were accusing her of hate speech and being transphobic, and that just boggles the mind. It definitely boggles my mind, and I wish that they had made the time to go into the prisons to talk to the Indigenous women that are being incarcerated and are being incarcerated with transgendered, and they don't have the luxury of insisting on having women-only spaces in prison.